On a night in the mid-1990s at Highgrove, with the whole household already dark, a footman watched a single light stay on in the study and heard Prince Charles ask quietly to be connected to a number he no longer had any official reason to call, and that number was Diana's. If stories like this one move you, subscribing costs nothing, and the bell means the next chapter finds you. 2 members of staff recalled that hour afterward. Neither of them ever quite let go of it. And the reason it stayed with them is simple. That request does not fit the version of the story the public was handed, because by then, officially, these 2 people did not speak. Not directly. Everything between the Prince of Wales and the Princess of Wales passed through lawyers and press officers, through cold letters and carefully worded statements read out to reporters. That was the picture the nation had. 2 strangers who had once been married, now communicating only through intermediaries, their every word filtered and approved. And yet, on this night, the footman said, the prince reached for the phone himself. Picture the house already dark, one light still burning in the study, and ask yourself why a man ending a marriage would reach for that phone at all. Hold that image, because it is the whole story in miniature. Highgrove was Charles's private world. His retreat in Gloucestershire, the garden he tended with something close to obsession, the one place where the future king could shut the door on the machinery of monarchy and simply be a man in an old house at night. The staff knew its rhythms. They knew when the corridors settled, when the last footsteps faded, when the great rooms went quiet and cold, and they knew which lights were meant to be off. The footman remembered the study lamp still glowing when the rest of the floor had gone black. He remembered the prince inside, not pacing, not agitated, but composed, and he remembered the request made in a low, even voice to be put through to a woman the entire world believed he was finished with. Now we have to be careful here about what we know and how we know it. The palace never confirmed this call. There is no official record of it, no entry in a diary released to the public, no statement acknowledging it ever happened. What we have is the memory of 2 members of staff, recounted later, and the quiet weight those 2 people gave it for years afterward. In the world of royal history, that is often all you get. The institution keeps its silences. The people who served inside it keep the truth. So this is where the story begins, not with a grand event, not with a headline, with a lamp left burning and a receiver lifted in an empty study, remembered by the only 2 people who happened to be near enough to hear. And to understand why that small moment matters so much, you have to set it against everything the public had been told. Because the public timeline of this marriage was not a private matter. It was one of the most watched collapses of the 20th century, played out on front pages and television screens in real time. Go back to December of 1992. The Prime Minister, John Major, stood up in the House of Commons and announced to Parliament that the Prince and Princess of Wales were to separate. He said it formally, in that flat parliamentary tone reserved for matters of state. And he added the line that would be quoted for years, that the separation had no constitutional implications, and that there were no plans for divorce. The country heard it read out as government business. The heir to the throne and his wife, their marriage now an item on the parliamentary record. Think about what that means. A private breakdown, announced by a Prime Minister to a chamber of politicians as a fact of national life. There was no going back from a moment like the separation was real, it was official, and it was public in the most absolute way a thing can be public in Britain. And then came the interview. November of 1995. Diana sat in a room at Kensington Palace, her eyes ringed with dark makeup, and she spoke to a BBC journalist for the Panorama programme in a way no member of the royal family had ever spoken before. She talked about the marriage. She talked about her unhappiness, her illness, her sense of being watched and managed and pushed aside. And she said the line that detonated in living rooms across the nation, that there were 3 of them in the marriage, so it was a bit crowded. More than 20 million people in Britain watched that broadcast. Families gathered around their sets the way they did for a coronation or a cup final, and they heard the Princess of Wales dismantle the official fairy tale piece by piece in her own voice on camera. It was not a leak. It was not a rumour attributed to a friend. It was Diana herself, looking down the lens, telling the country that the marriage they had celebrated had been a performance built over a wound. After Panorama, there was no ambiguity left. The Queen wrote to both of them. She told them in effect that the time for a divorce had come, and so the machinery started to turn. By 1996, that machinery was grinding through its final stages. The divorce itself moved forward with the cold efficiency of a legal process stripped of all feeling. Terms were negotiated, titles were adjusted, the settlement was argued over by people paid to argue over such things. Diana would keep the apartments at Kensington Palace, she would lose the style of Her Royal Highness, and the marriage that had begun in front of the world would end in a solicitor's paperwork. The decree became absolute in August of 1996. On paper, it was done. 2 signatures, and the fairy tale was legally dissolved. So now hold both pictures in your head at once. On one side, the official story, a separation announced to Parliament, a television interview that ended any pretense of privacy, a divorce processed like a transaction. 2 people who, by every public account, had stopped speaking to each other, except through the professionals they hired to speak for them. And on the other side, a lamp in a study at Highgrove, and Charles with the receiver in his hand, asking to be connected to her himself. Those 2 pictures do not belong to the same story. That is the anomaly. That is the crack in the version you were given. Because here is the thing about the telephone in that study. He had no reason to use it. Not an official one. There was no summit to arrange, no statement to coordinate, no lawyer's message to relay. Everything that needed saying between the Prince and Princess of Wales was, by 1996, being said for them by other people, in writing. A man in his position did not pick up a phone and dial his estranged wife directly. That was precisely what the whole apparatus of aides and secretaries existed to prevent. It kept distance. It kept control. It kept the appearance of 2 people who had moved on, and he reached past all of it, in the dark, on his own. That is why the 2 members of staff remembered. Servants in a great royal household see a great deal, and most of it they let go. It is the nature of the work. You witness the private life of the most famous family on earth, and you learn to hold none of it, to let the days blur into one long service of meals and messages and closed doors. But some moments refuse to blur. Some moments lodge in the memory and stay there for the rest of a life, sharp and undimmed, precisely because they do not make sense against everything else you thought you knew. This was one of those moments. A footman and one other member of the household carried it for years, not because it was scandalous, not because there was anything to sell, but because it did not match, because the man they saw at the phone that night was not the man the newspapers described, and the gap between the 2 would not close in their minds. Hold that question, because the household could not answer it either. The people closest to him, the ones who cleared his table and drew his curtains and knew his moods better than most, they had no explanation for why he made that call. They only knew that he made it. and that afterward the memory sat with them like a stone. This is the ground the whole story stands on, the gap between the image and the reality. The public was handed a clean narrative of two people who could no longer stand to be in the same room, whose lawyers passed messages back and forth so they would never have to. Underneath that narrative, in a darkened house on a night no one recorded, the future king lifted a receiver he had no business lifting and asked to hear the voice of the woman he was in the middle of divorcing. What does a man say in a moment like that? What could there possibly be left to say? When the separation had been read to Parliament, when the interview had been watched by 20 million, when the divorce was already all but signed and sealed. The reason to call was gone. The legal process would finish the job with or without him. Every practical thread between them had already been cut or was being cut by other hands. And still the light stayed on. And still he dialed. So we come to the question that the whole story turns on. Why call her that night at all? When the divorce was nearly done, when the marriage was a matter of paperwork, when nothing he could say would change a single term of the settlement, why did the Prince of Wales reach for that phone? It is not a rhetorical question. There is an answer, or rather, there are competing answers, and they come from people who were close enough to the household to have views worth hearing, because the two members of staff who witnessed the call were not the only ones who thought about it afterward. Those who studied this family, who spent years tracing the private currents beneath the public surface, they turned that same night over in their minds and reached for explanations. And here is where it gets interesting, because they did not agree. According to a biographer close to the household, the call was not sentiment at all. It was not longing, not regret, not some private ache breaking through in the dark. It was a trigger, a practical one, a decision about one of the boys, William or Harry, a matter of a school or a holiday, that neither parent would settle by memo, a thing so bound up with being a mother and a father that it could not be reduced to a lawyer's letter. On that reading, the phone call was almost mundane. Two parents, whatever else had broken between them, forced to speak because a child needed a decision only they could make. But a former member of staff gave that same night a very different name. Not a school run, not a holiday, something heavier, something the biographer's tidy explanation left no room for at all. One word. And it changes everything about the man standing at that phone. Guilt. That was the word. Not paperwork, not a school run, not a memo neither of them would answer. A former member of the household, speaking years later, put it plainly. The king reached for that telephone because he felt guilty, and there is no gentler way to say it, so you have two accounts of the same hour, told by two people who were both in that house. One says the call was cold logic. The other says it was a wound. And here is the thing worth sitting with. Two people in that same house the same night. Remember, two different reasons. Decide for yourself which one you believe. Start with the biographer's version, because it is the tidier one. It goes like this. There was a decision to be made about one of the boys, William or Harry, a school term, a holiday, a change of plan, something small on paper and enormous in practice, the kind of thing two ordinary parents settle in a 5-minute phone call at the kitchen table. But Charles and Diana were not ordinary parents. By the mid-1990s, they ran their lives through separate courts, separate private secretaries, separate press offices, each quietly briefing against the other. A message from one to the other travelled through a chain of aides who softened it, timed it, sometimes buried it. Nothing passed directly. Everything passed through a filter, and a biographer close to the household suggested that on this one question, the filter failed. Some decisions cannot be delegated. You cannot have a private secretary tell your child's mother what will happen to your child. At some point, a father has to pick up the receiver himself and say the words in his own voice. So he did. In this telling, the call is not romance at all. It is administration that finally became too human to hand to a member of staff. It is a believable story. It fits the man. Charles was, by every account, someone who preferred a letter to a confrontation, who would rather write his feelings than speak them across a room. A telephone call he could not avoid, forced on him by his own sons, fits everything we know about how uncomfortable he was with the direct approach. And yet, the former member of staff heard something else in that same night. Not a logistics call, a reaching. A man in the act of losing something, turning back toward it before it was gone, because by then the losing was almost complete. The lawyers had nearly finished. The separation was years old. The public had already watched the marriage come apart in slow motion on their own television screens. There was nothing left to negotiate and no reunion on the table, which is exactly why guilt makes a kind of sense the school run does not. You do not feel guilt over a timetable. You feel it over a person. You feel it when the machinery you set in motion is doing precisely what you asked it to do, and you suddenly cannot stand the sound of it. That is the version the staff member could not shake. A man signing away a marriage who picked up the phone in the middle of it, not to change anything, but simply to hear her voice once more while he still could. Two motives, a decision, or a conscience, and the frustrating, honest truth is that both can be true at once. Perhaps one of the boys gave him the excuse, and the guilt gave him the reason, and the two arrived on the same night at the same darkened study, and he reached for the telephone he had no official reason to use. To understand why either of those explanations carries any weight, you have to go back. Back before the separate courts, before the lawyers, before the man who could not stand the sound of his own divorce. You have to go back to the beginning, to the day the whole world decided it was watching a fairy tale. The 29th of July, 1981, St. Paul's Cathedral, a summer morning in London, and a nation that had been told for months that it was about to see something out of a storybook, and in a sense it was. The 1981 wedding was built to be exactly that. The bride was a shy 19-year-old, Lady Diana Spencer, not long out of her teens, a kindergarten assistant who blushed when cameras found her, who glanced down and away when reporters pushed too close. She arrived at the cathedral in a gown with a train so long it seemed to keep unfolding out of the carriage for a full minute, 25 feet of ivory silk crumpling and spilling across the cathedral steps. 750 million people watched her walk up that aisle. Sit with that number for a moment. 750 million human beings, in living rooms from Manchester to Melbourne to Los Angeles, all tuned to the same young woman on the same morning. The most watched wedding in the history of the planet up to that point. And at the centre of it, a girl of 19 who, by her own later account, was already frightened. Then the balcony, the kiss, Buckingham Palace, the crowd below roaring, the future king and his young bride leaning together in front of the entire world. It is one of the most reproduced images of the 20th century. And it was, the public was assured, the picture of a love that would carry the monarchy into the next generation. Here is what the 750 million did not see. The fairy tale had already begun to curdle before the ink on the register was dry, and the reason had a name. Camilla. Camilla Parker Bowles had been part of Charles's life long before Diana entered it, and she did not leave it when the wedding bells stopped. Diana learned this the way people usually learn such things, slowly, then all at once. A remembered detail, a piece of jewellery, a phrase overheard, a closeness that did not fade the way she had been promised it would. In her own account, given much later, she described a marriage that had felt crowded from the start, as though there had always been a third presence in the room. You can date the private unravelling almost to the honeymoon. The shy 19-year-old on the cathedral steps became, within a few years, a young woman who understood that the man she had married had never fully let go of someone else. She was not imagining it. She was not, as some around the palace preferred to suggest, simply unstable or overwrought. She was, in the plainest terms, correct. And this is where the machine comes in. Because the moment a royal marriage begins to fail, it stops being a private matter between two people. It becomes a problem of image, and the institution that surrounded Charles and Diana had one overwhelming priority, not their happiness, their appearance. The crown, in this story, is not an abstraction. It is people. It is the private secretaries who managed every public appearance. It is the courtiers who decided which photographs were released and which were quietly killed. It is the press officers who spun a smile on a factory visit into evidence of a marriage in fine health. And above all of them, it is the sovereign herself, an unbending queen who had spent her entire reign believing that the monarchy survives by never showing the crack. Elizabeth II did not build that instinct out of coldness. She built it out of history. She had watched her own uncle walk away from the throne for love and nearly break the institution doing it. She had seen what happened when a Windsor put private feeling above public duty. And so the message that came down through the aides, gently but without room for argument, was always the same. Whatever is happening behind the doors stay shut. You appear together. You smile together. You do not let the country see two people who have stopped loving each other. And that is the engine of this entire story. An institution demanding a public marriage from a private man who could not make himself feel one. Charles had been trained his whole life to serve the crown. Duty was not a word to him. It was the water he swam in. But the crown was asking for something no amount of training can deliver. It was asking him to perform a love he did not have, indefinitely, in front of 750 million people and everyone who came after them. He could not do it, neither could she. And for a decade, the pressure built between the man who could not fake the marriage and the institution that could not survive the truth until it detonated in public in ways the palace could never fully contain. Which brings us back at last to the study, the lamp still burning, the corridors gone quiet, the receiver in his hand connecting a call he had no official reason to make to a number the aides would have told him to leave alone. This is the part they all remembered. So listen closely to what he actually said. Because here is the thing that surprises people. The words, as the household staff reconstructed them afterward, were not what you would expect from a man in the grip of guilt or longing. They were not romantic. There was no confession, no plea, no sweeping declaration. What the staff described was almost the opposite, careful, formal, controlled. He asked after her the way a man asks after someone he is meant to keep at a distance. He asked how she was. He asked in the measured phrasing of someone who has spent his life being observed, after the mother of his children. The staff who pieced the conversation together later remembered the strange restraint of it, as though, even alone, even at that hour, even with no cameras and no courtiers, he could not quite drop the register of a future king. And then something shifted. The voice dropped. Those who could hear him described the change more than the words, a lowering, a softening, the formality thinning out, and underneath it something rawer coming through. And in that lower voice, as the staff reconstructed it, came something close to an apology, not a grand one, not a speech, just a man saying in some form of words that he was sorry it had come to this, that he was sorry it had come to this. Think about the weight in that small sentence, from that particular man. Charles was not a person who apologized easily to anyone about anything. The institution did not raise its airs to say, sorry. And here, in an empty study, to the wife he was in the process of losing, with the divorce grinding toward its conclusion, he said it anyway, quietly, when he thought no one who mattered was listening. But of course, someone was. 2 members of staff carried that hour out of the house with them and never quite set it down. They were not eavesdropping in any grand sense. They were simply there, the way staff are always there, part of the furniture of a royal life, present at the edges of moments the family believes are private. And what they caught was not gossip. It was the sound of a man being honest for once, in a house built to prevent exactly that. And yet, for all they heard, there was a limit to it. Because a telephone call has 2 ends, they could hear him, his careful questions, his lowered voice, his apology. What they could not hear was her. Diana was a voice on a line in another place, and everything she said in answer travelled straight into his ear and no further. The staff strained. Of course they did. You would too. A moment like that and the whole story hanging on a reply you cannot hear. But there was nothing to catch. No echo, no raised voice down the line, no fragment leaking out, only him, standing in the lamplight, listening. And then the silence. After he said he was sorry, the household side heard him stop and wait and listen. Whatever Diana said back to him, she said it into a silence that only he occupied. The staff watched his face and nothing else. They read what they could from the set of his jaw, the way his eyes moved, the long pause where he simply held the receiver and took in whatever was coming from the other end. Because no one there could hear Diana's reply, and within months there would be no way left on this earth to ask her what she had said. And she never got the chance to say it again, to anyone, because the ask that no one there could answer would soon become an ask no one on earth could answer. Diana died in Paris in August 1997, a car in a tunnel under the Pont de l'Alma, a crash a little after midnight, and by the small hours of the next morning, she was gone. She was 36 years old. The divorce was recently final, only about a year settled, the ink barely dry on the machinery that had spent years grinding the marriage into paperwork. And then, in a single night, the paperwork stopped mattering. There was no longer a former wife to negotiate with, no shared custody to arrange by memo, no cold future to plan around. There was a mother of 2 boys, dead in another country, and a man who had once picked up a telephone in a darkened house to hear her voice one more time. Think about what that does to a memory. When the phone call happened, it was strange, but survivable, a private moment in a public war. The kind of thing a footman notices, files away, maybe mentions to one other person and no one else. But after Paris, that same night stopped being a footnote. It became something the 2 members of staff could not put down, because now they understood what they had actually witnessed, without knowing it at the time. It was, in retrospect, close to the last private thing that passed between them. That is the weight of it. Not the words, not even the silence, the timing. After that call, there were public occasions, of course. There were the boys. There were the necessary crossings of two lives that could never fully separate while William and Harry existed, but a genuinely private exchange, Charles alone in a room reaching for her, with no aide listening, no camera, no press office shaping the version, no lawyer in the middle. That, the staff came to believe, had happened maybe once more, maybe not at all. The lamp-lit study at Highgrove may have held one of the last unguarded conversations of a 12-year marriage that the whole world thought it had watched from beginning to end. And here is the cruelty of it. He got his moment, he asked to be connected, he waited, he spoke, he listened. He had the thing he reached for. He just did not know it was almost the last of its kind. Nobody in that house knew. You never do. That is what made the two witnesses hold on so tightly afterward, turning it over, comparing what each remembered, checking the details against each other the way people do when a small, ordinary hour turns out to have been enormous. So what do we do with it now? Because a call like this invites the wrong conclusion, and it is worth stopping the easy reading before it starts. It is tempting to hear that a divorcing man phoned his soon-to-be ex-wife late at night, said he was sorry, and to build from that a secret love story, a hidden reconciliation, a version where, if the tunnel had never happened, they might have found their way back. That reading is comforting. It is also almost certainly false. The call reveals no secret reconciliation. There is nothing in any account attributed to household staff, nothing in the biographers close to the household that suggests Charles wanted the marriage back. He did not. By every measure that marriage was over, and both of them had spent years making sure of it. The 1992 separation announced to Parliament, the 1995 interview that went off like a bomb in the nation's living rooms, the divorce moving through its cold machinery until it was final. He was not trying to undo any of that. So if it was not love in the reunion sense, and it was not strategy, and it was not the divorce, then what was it? Now weigh everything you have heard, because this is what that one phone call actually tells us. It tells us the man was divided, not confused, not secretly pining, divided in the oldest and most exhausting sense of the word. Charles had been raised, groomed, trained across his entire life for one thing above all others, the crown, duty as an inheritance and a cage at the same time. From childhood, he was the heir, the future king, the man whose personal wants would always come second to the institution he would one day embody. The firm, the aides, the unbending queen, all of it pointed in a single direction, and that direction was always the appearance of order. The monarchy survives on continuity, on the sense that the private feelings of the people inside it will never be allowed to shake the thing itself, and against all of that machinery stood one plain human fact. He could not cleanly release her. That is the payoff of the whole story, and it is quieter than you might want it to be. He was releasing the marriage. He genuinely was. The lawyers were finishing it, the settlement was agreed, the titles were being adjusted, the two households were being formally pulled apart. On paper, on the record, in every way the Crown could measure, Charles was letting Diana go exactly as duty required. But something in him would not complete the motion. He reached for the phone he had no official reason to use, in a house where every reason to call her had already been handled by someone else. And he called anyway, because releasing something on paper is not the same as releasing it inside your chest. That is the gap. The whole gap this story lives inside. The public saw a marriage ended by solicitors, two names on a decree, a cold and completed transaction. Two members of staff saw a man in a lamplit study who could not stop himself from reaching one more time. The crown he had trained his whole life to serve, and the marriage he could not cleanly release, even as he was releasing it, in the same season, in the same man, in the same trembling few minutes on a telephone line. That is what the title of this whole story finally means. The night he called Diana back was never about calling her back into the marriage. It was a man caught exactly between the two halves of himself, doing his duty with one hand and betraying his own composure with the other, and not able, in that moment, to be only the king. And the silence, that long silence on the line that only he could hear, becomes the most honest part of it, because we have his side. We have, roughly, the careful words the staff reconstructed, the asking after the boys, the lower voice, the something like an apology. What we do not have, what nobody has, is her half. Diana said something back. She always did. She was never a woman who went quiet on a telephone. Somewhere in that hour, she answered him, fully, in her own words. And the only living person who heard those words was the man holding the receiver in a darkened study at Highgrove. He has never repeated it, not to a biographer, not in any authorized account, not in the decades since, through every retelling of that marriage, every documentary, every anniversary, every moment when repeating it might have softened his public image or won him sympathy. He has kept it. Whatever Diana said to him on the line that night, in the last stretch of a marriage nobody could save, stayed with him, and only him. The staff heard the shape of the conversation. They never heard the content of her reply. And the one man who did has carried it unspoken for more than 25 years. There is a kind of loyalty in that silence that the public version of Charles never allowed for. The cold prince, the man who chose Camilla, the husband in the interview saying he had been faithful until the marriage broke down. That is the image. And then here is this, a man who could have used her private words, and never did, who could have shaped the story his way and chose to let it die with her. Say what you will about the marriage, and plenty has been said, but a man who keeps a dead woman's last private words to himself for a quarter of a century is not the man the tabloids drew. If a story told this way, from the household side rather than the headlines, is the kind of thing you want more of, then subscribing costs nothing, and turning on the bell means the next chapter of royal history actually reaches you instead of getting lost. There are more of these to come, and they are the ones you were never really meant to hear, because this is what the two witnesses were left holding, and now you are holding it too. Not a confession, not a scandal, a gap, the distance between what the world was told and what two people in a quiet house actually saw. The palace never officially confirmed the call. It never had to. Its version was clean, and the clean version was the point. Two households, one decree, a modern royal divorce handled with as much dignity as the machinery could manage. That was the image the institution needed, and the institution got it. What the staff saw did not fit that image, and it was never meant to reach you. A future king, alone with a telephone he had no business using, asking to be put through to a number he had given up any right to call, and then falling silent to listen to a voice the rest of the house could not hear. That is not the story of an institution. That is the story of a person the institution had spent a lifetime trying to make behave like an institution, and the one night the person slipped through. And then it ended, the way these things end, with nothing dramatic at all. The conversation ran its course. He said whatever he said last. She said whatever she said last, the thing he has never repeated. And the receiver went down. Picture it, because this is where the whole story comes to rest. The empty study, the single lamp still burning after the rest of Highgrove had gone dark, a man sitting with his hand still resting on a telephone that had already gone quiet, in a room where no one else remained. The corridors settled, the household asleep or pretending to be. And that one light, the light a footman noticed because it stayed on when everything else had switched off, still burning in the window. Then a hand reaches for the lamp, and the light goes out. The study goes dark. The window that had glowed against the black grounds of Highgrove disappears into the rest of the house, and whatever passed on that line, whatever a losing husband said and a lost wife answered, is sealed inside a dark room, kept by one man who never opened it again. Within a year, she would be dead in Paris. Within a few more, the boys would be grown men attending memorials for a mother they lost as children. And Charles would become king, exactly as the whole machinery had always planned, crowned at last, composed alone at the top of the thing he had trained his entire life to carry. Everything the crown demanded of him, he became. The one thing it could never make him do was forget an hour in a lamplit study and repeat what he heard. So we are left where the staff were left, with his voice and not hers, with the shape of a conversation and not its heart, with the certainty that a future king reached for a wife he was losing, and the permanent blank where her answer should be. That is the question the palace never answered, and the one he has kept to himself ever since. Not whether the call happened. Two people who were there are sure it did. Not why exactly, though guilt and the boys and something older than both are the honest guesses. The real question, the one that outlasts the marriage and the divorce and even the death, is simpler and much harder. What does a future king say to the wife he is losing when he thinks no one important is listening? When the aides are asleep and the cameras are gone and the press office cannot touch it? When it is just a man and a telephone and a woman on the other end who will be gone before he fully understands what the night was worth? What do you say then? In the one moment nobody was supposed to see. He knows. He is the only one who does. The only one alive who ever heard the other half. And in an empty study, with the receiver back in its cradle and the last light switched off, he took the answer into the dark with him, and he has kept it there ever since. The window goes black, and whatever was said stays said only once.